So this is the second sermon in our Questions Jesus Asked sermon series. And one of the things that we'll hopefully see by the end of this series is that questions reveal priorities. The questions people ask us, the questions we ask people, the questions we pose to institutions or to the earthly powers around us, they all reveal where our hearts and our minds are at. And we may not always articulate it that way, but we kind of know that that's what's going on. The disability justice team here at Concord Trinity is a great example of that. When they ask why this space in the sanctuary is not accessible to all, it's clear that their priority is justice and inclusion for those who are differently abled. Well, the same thing is true of Jesus. We see in our passage this morning that the questions he asks, as well as the questions he doesn't ask, reveal what his priorities are. Now, the text we're looking at is actually just a piece of the larger narrative about Lazarus and his resurrection. The full story runs for about 44 some odd verses, but I just took a piece out of that today that I think speaks into the general thrust of where our series is going this Lent. And so the first verse of this passage tells us that when Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, this may seem like a throwaway detail, but it's actually probably a big part of the story. See, there's this ancient Jewish tradition that when somebody dies, their soul kind of hovers around their body for about 3 days. And then around the 4th day, upon seeing that the body had permanently changed, goes to the afterlife. So this little detail that Lazarus had been dead 4 days isn't just a passive observation. It's confirmation that there's no question that Lazarus was actually dead, that the miracle the people are about to see is genuine and authentic. And for those of us that are reading this story 2,000 years later, we can see that. We have kind of this bird's eye view over what this story is about and where it's going, but the people who were there had no idea what was going to happen. They had no idea where it was going. And once we understand that, we can kind of understand this first interaction between Martha and Jesus. Our passage says that when Martha heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, and the first thing she said to him was, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, there's a theory that this was just Martha's way of admitting Jesus' lordship, that this was just a way for her to say, yes, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God. But I don't really buy that. I think Martha was so wrapped up in grief and pain and anger and confusion that she actually uttered something real. And I know there are some people that feel like we're not allowed to be angry at God, that by being honest with God, we're somehow hurting God's feelings. But one of the things that we see from this interaction between Martha and Jesus is that God is big enough to handle our anger. God is big enough to handle our grief and our confusion and our pain. If I were a betting man, I'd be willing to put down some money that those who are listening to this sermon right now have probably felt this way at some point in their life, but were too afraid to say anything. Lord, if you had been here, my marriage wouldn't have fallen apart. Lord, if you had been here, I wouldn't have lost my job. I'm sure there are a lot of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip right now holding a lifeless body saying, Lord, if you had been here, my child wouldn't have been killed. There's nothing wrong with speaking plainly to God because God already knows what's there. We're not actually hiding anything by refusing to be honest and bring it out into the open. The place, though, where it goes sideways is when we don't follow it up the way Martha does. Right? She openly grieves the death of her brother in front of Jesus and then immediately turns to, but even now, I know God will give you whatever you ask of him. Sometimes it's in the throes of our deepest grief and anger that we find our deepest faith, because we can see at that moment that Jesus is still standing there with us, that he didn't walk away, that our anger didn't scare him away. He's still there with us, and he can speak to us the same hope that he speaks to Martha. We see right after Martha offers up this statement of belief that Jesus says this, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Now, this requires a little bit of Old Testament. So, at the time of Jesus, there were kind of two competing schools of thought. One that affirmed an afterlife sometime at the end of time or in the final day, and then those who didn't, right? The Pharisees were the leaders of those who affirmed belief in a resurrection, and the Sadducees were those who didn't. Now, this tradition of the resurrection comes from two main places in the Old Testament. The first is Daniel 12, verse 2, and 2 Maccabees 7, verse 9, both of which offer a glimpse into this final day in which those who had fallen asleep will awaken to everlasting life, or something like that. And so there's this clear tradition in which the resurrection of the dead will happen on the last day. And so when Jesus comes to Martha and says that somehow this resurrection is not a future reality, but is mysteriously contained within this person standing right in front of her, it's this earth-shattering paradigm shift. It's something that nobody had ever said before. And we're going to get to the central question of this text here in a minute, but there's something we need to acknowledge in this story. We may not always see it when we look specifically at this text, but if we look at the context of John's gospel, this scene in which Jesus raises Lazarus to life and offers hope to the people is his final straw. Immediately after this, we see religious leaders and Pharisees and scribes and all these people gather together and start to plot the execution of Jesus. Not because he was a threat to the people, but because he was a threat to the power of the reigning authority at the time. See, the way that these religious leaders saw it, these Jewish leaders, was that if more and more Jews were following this peasant Jewish teacher and rabbi, the Roman Empire would see it as a political threat, and they would have to deal with Jesus and the rest of his ilk, the rest of the religious leaders, the temple, the Jewish community. It would all be under some kind of a threat. And so they weren't concerned about the fact that Jesus was teaching and preaching and healing. They were worried about the critique that it posed to their power. And there's something we need to learn in here. The resurrection has political implications. I'll say it again for anybody who didn't catch it the first time. The resurrection has political implications. If we believe that Jesus, this flesh and blood figure who lived a historical, concrete existence in a specific time and place in history, is somehow the comprehensive reality of the resurrection, then we have to believe that who he was and what he did and what he believed and what his convictions were somehow inform the way we think about the resurrection today. And I'm sorry if it's uncomfortable for some to hear, but a resurrection exclusively interested in what happens after this life is not the resurrection Jesus was interested in. Because Martha tried that. Martha offered up that vision of the resurrection as this future reality that would happen on the last day, and Jesus says, no. We're not talking about the future, we're talking about right now. It was this message of a resurrected life offering hope and empowerment and liberation to the people that would get Jesus killed, and it was this resurrection that Jesus gave to Martha and asked do you believe this? Notice the simplicity of Jesus' question here. Do you believe this? Now, I've checked the manuscripts, and I've read the Greek, and I've done the research. I can assure you there's no asterisk after this question pointing you to some fine print at the bottom of the page. The question Jesus asks is simply, do you believe this? It's a simple question. And I'm constantly amazed by the church's ability to fumble around and mess it up. Because we get so tied up in technicalities and theologies and philosophies, and we completely lose sight of the gospel. Whole traditions, entire denominations who would all answer this question the same way have been torn apart by things that have nothing to do with it. There's only one question that Jesus asked here to affirm this woman's faith, and there's about 1 million that he didn't. He didn't ask, what denomination do you belong to? Or what's your theology of Scripture? Or do you tithe the full 10%? Or what's your sexual orientation? Or why don't you wear nicer clothes to worship? Or when was the last time you went to church? He doesn't ask any of that. He just asks, do you believe this? Remember, questions reveal priorities. Jesus' priority here is to figure out if this woman, Martha, standing right in front of him, is interested in living this resurrected life during her time on earth, and then trusting God to handle whatever the resurrection looks like on the other side. The Christian life that we are so prone to overcomplicate is nothing more than a perpetual confrontation with this question of belief and then the living out of our response. And sometimes that response is, I don't know. Sometimes that response is, yeah, but I'm unsure about this. And please hear me when I tell you that that's okay. I've said it before, I'm going to say it now, and I'll say it another 1,000,000 times throughout the course of my ministry. If you don't have doubts, you're not paying attention. But even in those moments of doubt, even in those moments when we are trying to figure out what we think and believe about these certain things, we still answer this question in the way that we live. It can be really hard to be in this world. It can be really hard to be present in this world that's so full of suffering and pain. And it's a human thing to wonder if meaning can be brought out of it, if beauty can be brought out of it. But if it's one thing I've learned from reading the Bible, it's that the God who liberated the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, the God who liberated Jesus from the bonds of death, is the God who is going to liberate and has liberated and continues to liberate this world from the earthly powers that ensnare it. Because you know what? Earthly powers can silence hopeful people, but it can't silence hope. War and violence can kill people yearning to be free, but it can't kill freedom. The power of empire can execute Jesus, but it can't execute the resurrection. The question for the church is, do we believe this? And if we do, then the question becomes, what are we going to do about it?